And here we go.
Welcome to the Great Work Insights podcast by the O.C. Tanner Institute, the show that features the people, the professionals, the thought leaders, and the coolest companies. And now your host, the man navigating the discussion about the culture, the organized chaos, and the best practices that compel great work, Todd Nordstrom.
I have a confession to make. Many years ago, I worked for a political consulting firm. That's my confession. My job was to write brochures, pamphlets, and speeches for candidates trying to get elected or re-elected to office. Basically, this meant digging through piles of research and legislation, and you know how it goes. My intention was to, I admit, make the opposing candidate look bad. And strangely, I was really good at it. At first, of course, this was fun. I'd find little nuggets of information that allowed me to crush an opponent's campaign. I'd find other nuggets that helped me position my candidate in a positive light. But as you might have guessed by watching any political season, the closer you get to election day, the uglier the whole process gets. That's what we're going through right now. Yes, I have a confession. I am a quitter. I lasted through one political season and threw in my towel as a political writer because it was just nasty. That's the only way I can explain it. Not to get political in this podcast, but I personally love the idea of change in a democracy. I love to watch movements, ideologies that capture the hearts and minds of people and organizations. Ideologies that somehow take off, become bigger than their own parts with the intent to somehow better our world or our community or even our individual lives. I don't often jump on the bandwagon of many movements, but today our guest is not only a longtime friend of mine and a former coworker of mine, but he's also a guy that sits on the national board of directors for a movement that is, let's say, swelling right now in our country, and it needs some discussion. It's called Conscious Capitalism, and my guest today is Brian Mohr. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks a lot, Todd. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Brian, I've had you as a guest on this show before to talk about an executive recruitment firm that you co-founded that is based on people connecting to their purpose, or companies connecting to their purpose, both, all of the above. I know you can talk conceptually about how important purpose is to all of us, but today I want to focus on conscious capitalism as a movement. You sit on the national board of directors for the organization with some pretty reputable names, might I add. Tell the listeners what conscious capitalism is, what does the organization do, and why do you do it?
Well, I love talking about this, Todd, and you're right. The board does consist of some pretty impressive business professionals, folks like John Mackey of Whole Foods, Vidar Jorgensen from Grameen America, Kip Tyndall from the Container Store, wow. Raj Sisodia, who co-authored the Conscious Capitalism book with John Mackey, Doug Rao, the former president of Trader Joe's and now the CEO and founder of a new grocery store chain called Daily Table. So it's a great group. I've obviously left out a number of folks who are all just amazing in their own right. You know, the organization is all about, it's quite simple, it's to elevate humanity through business. And, you know, the world we live in today, capitalism as a system is under attack, and perhaps rightly so, based on some of the more recent events, like the Great Recession that we just went through. And I actually just finally got around to watching the movie The Big Short, and it's understandable why some of our younger generation see capitalism and see greed and make a connection between the two, and inherently think that business is just bad and it's wreaking more havoc than creating more good.
It's interesting, when you talk about that. And right now, I'm just poking around on Conscious Capitalism's website, and I'm reading the credo of the movement. Obviously, we like you said, we live in a country based on capitalism, and I highly doubt when you go speak to businesses, you don't have problems persuading businesses and business people to become more capitalistic. But like you say, there's a lot of this younger generation that's seeing capitalism as bad. But do you find a lot of companies struggle with the definition of the word conscious?
It's interesting. I haven't engaged in that many conversations to form the most solid of opinions on the word conscious, but I think the word is right, and I've gone back and forth. It's unfortunate that some might dismiss it quite quickly because of the word and perhaps its connection to, meditation or yoga or mindfulness or some of these other buzz topics, which frankly aren't buzz anymore. These are multi-billion-dollar industries, and frankly, some very powerful tools that we need to be incorporating into our daily lives. But yeah, your point's well made in that you don't have to convince business that they need to be more capitalistic. The goal here is to really return business to where it started from, and that's to create a service that benefits multiple stakeholders. And somewhere along the way, in the late 20th century, the emphasis became shareholder maximization only. And I think a lot of that was made popular by Milton Friedman's 1976, I believe it was 76, New York Times piece that declared the only social responsibility of business is to maximize shareholder value. And business leaders can maximize shareholder value or investor value by pulling lots of other levers, and those levers can very often have adverse impact on all of the other stakeholders, like the employees, the customers themselves, the vendors, the suppliers, and the community that is heavily reliant on the business doing the right thing. And so, yeah, I do think they need to be more conscious and recognize the impact that business has on more than just investors or shareholders.
Yeah, stakeholders, what we often don't think of stakeholders being the community that's around a business that's creating capital. And I think, I think that's interesting too, that when you were talking about consciousness, mindful is probably a good word of all of those that you directly impact. Brian, because you've been on this show before, a lot of the listening audience are leaders in companies, they're HR executives, they're members of the C-suite, and they're frontline managers who may not necessarily have the ability to influence the entire organization. What does an organization like Conscious Capitalism want from listeners, all that group that I just mentioned? If I can't impact my organization, can I play with Conscious Capitalism? What do you want from me?
Yeah, you absolutely can play with conscious capitalism, and I think it's one of those. It's a philosophy, it's an ideology, and business has lifted. Capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty. And at the current trends, there's a high likelihood that as a result of capitalism, extreme poverty in the world will be all but eradicated over the next 30 years. Less than 12% of the world's population today lives on less than $1.25. And that used to be, not that long ago, more than 40% of the world's population. That's a result of creating jobs through businesses that are providing value. And so for the frontline manager, for a director, for a VP, for a C-suite, you can have major impact simply in how you approach your business. You don't have to influence the entire organization. You simply influence your sphere of influence, the people within eyesight, earshot, and begin to bring these principles, which are quite simple. There's only 4 of them, that business need to have and organized around a higher purpose, something that benefits the greater good. The second is this stakeholder orientation that we've talked about. So think about your business as an ecosystem, not an ego system only benefiting shareholders. You need to have leadership that is thinking about how to consciously lead the organization, and thereby the fourth, creating a very conscious culture. And everybody has the opportunity to create that impact. It's great when it comes from the top, and frankly, for an entire organization to shift. Clearly, the leadership needs to buy into it, but everybody can begin to create impact and thinking along these four principles, whether or not their company is going to embrace it wholly from the top down.
That's fascinating, because when I opened this podcast, I was talking about what is a movement, and Conscious Capitalism. It's an organization. It's also the title of a best-selling book explaining the concept and / movement. But that what you just said makes it a movement, correct? Anybody can join.
Anybody can join. There's no special handshake or anything like that. You don't need a special title. There's events, there's chapters around the world that are organized very organically, very grassroots. There's one here where I live in Arizona. There's 16 or 17 around the United States. There's 10, I believe, internationally. And these are all being organized by people who simply care deeply about the power of capitalism and the power of using business as a force for good. Technology is a wonderful thing, and perhaps one of the greatest things that it's done for us is that it's opened our eyes to the problems that exist in the world today, and where we may have been able to bury our heads in the sand and not see them because we didn't have any access to them through our major media. We now can see that there's people in faraway places and even close places that are struggling, and to use business to help solve those problems is a win-win. And so anybody can join the movement. Everybody can make a difference. And frankly, that's how this thing's going to grow. It's not a leadership only or a C-suite only type of movement.
Brian, I know Conscious Capitalism has a presence at a lot of conferences, like HR conferences and so forth. And I know that you go out and you speak to a lot of companies a lot, and a lot of the members of Conscious Capitalism also go out and speak a lot. From you personally, when you go out, and maybe I'm at a conference and I hear about this for the first time, what's the typical reaction that you see from business leaders?
Well, that's a great question. It's a split audience. It really is. And we can call it, or I'll call it a 50-50 split. 50%, you can just see their eyes light up. They're on the edge of their chair, and they recognize that this is the way business is going to operate in the future. And then there's the other 50% who, they're a little more skeptical. It's not that they're wrong and this is right. It's that they grew up in a time and a place and have had experience running business in a way that is what they know. And when you think about the number of generations in the workforce today, Todd, we've got 5 different generations in the workforce. And what matters tremendously to some of the younger generations is different than how they expect the business to be run. It's different than what the older generations grew up in and the way business operated. And as a result of sort of this clash, you've just got some leaders who have been in the trenches for a lot longer that need to think about, assuming they're going to stay in business and their companies are going to continue to stay competitive, that in order to get the best talent, they're going to have to create something meaningful about the work, something that goes far beyond just making money. And making money is great. It would be socially irresponsible for a company not to make money. But time and time again, the data points suggest, and the Firms of Endearment book is a great book for those who haven't read it, again called Firms of Endearment, that organizations that are guided by a higher purpose and that are run through a deep love and care of their people and their stakeholders end up making more money. And it's an irrefutable point, and that's what people are clamoring for. And so, I know it's a long answer to a short question about what the split is between the audience. Half immediately get it and they're on board, and half of the audience, I just think they're probably the data-driven folks, and God bless them. We need those folks, but they need to see more data, and maybe they just haven't seen what they need to see to fully believe in the power of what this movement's all about.
Brian, I know you could go on and on and on for days, but I know you're huge on the power of of purpose and what it can do for both people and companies to connect on a level of purpose. And your company is called Y Scouts. Your entire company is built on purpose. If listeners want to learn more about conscious capitalism or how they can become part of the movement, where can they find Conscious Capitalism? Where can they find you, Brian? Where can they find their local chapter? Where do you send them?
So for all information on Conscious Capitalism, it's pretty simple. Go to consciouscapitalism.org, spelled just like it sounds. There is the big annual conference that's happening in Chicago for Conscious Capitalism. Some amazing keynote speakers. John Mackey is going to be a keynote speaker. Daniel, his last name's escaping me, the CEO and founder of Kind Snacks. Daniel, starts with an L. Forgive me, I'd butcher it even if it were in front of me. He's going to be one of the keynote speakers as well. So that's happening April 12th, 13th, and 14th. The Conscious Capitalism website has all of the chapter information on it, so you can seek out if there's a local chapter in your area. And even if there isn't, there are limited restrictions to starting a chapter. Obviously, you need to be a big believer in the movement. You want to be able to devote the amount of time and attention necessary to getting a chapter going, but chapters are beginning to pop up all over the country and, frankly, all over the world. As far as me personally and Y Scouts, it's yscouts.com, the letter Y, the word scouts.com. And I'm all over the place. I'm traveling all the time, sharing the good message of the importance of purpose-based leadership and what it will do for the business world as we continue to race towards a pretty murky future that will be decided by those who are in our leadership roles, both in business and in government and on the world stage.
And I also highly recommend to listeners, I've seen Raj present a few times on the book titled Conscious Capitalism, and it's, once you really dive into the details, it's really fascinating stuff. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise. I always love talking to you, Todd. Thanks for having me.
Would you like to be featured as a guest on Great Work Insights? If yes, we want to hear from you. Leave us a comment with who you are and what you're all about at www.octanner.com. Also, remember to rate, review, and subscribe to all our podcasts on iTunes. Now get out there and build something beautiful. It's your turn now.